Ma'am, step away from the property right now. The officer's voice cut clean through the morning, flat, controlled, like this was already something bigger than it looked. Red and blue lights washed over my driveway, turning oil stains into shadows, turning quiet into spectacle. For a second, I just stood there, hand on the garage frame, coffee cooling behind me on the porch. Because 10 minutes earlier, this was just a hinge, a loose bolt, a normal morning. Then the cruisers rolled in. 1, 2, 3. Gravel crunching slow, like they wanted people to hear it. And they did. Curtains shifted. Doors cracked open. Phones came out. And across the street, right where she always places herself when something goes wrong, stood Linda Whitmore. Arms folded. Waiting. That smile already in place. Sharp. Certain. Like she'd been rehearsing this moment. Sir, we received a report of suspicious activity. The second officer didn't look at me when he said it. He looked past me, into my garage, scanning, expecting something. Illegal, hidden, dangerous. All he saw was a ladder, paint cans, an old radio still humming low on a country station, and a wrench in my hand. Suspicious activity. I let those words sit, rolled them around in my head, trying to figure out when fixing your own property became something that needed a police response. That's when she stepped forward, heels against pavement. Click, click. Linda, her white SUV parked behind her, perfectly angled, like it belonged in a brochure. I told you this wouldn't be tolerated, she said. Voice soft, polished, but edged just enough to let me know this wasn't about rules. This was about control. Industrial behavior lowers property values. Industrial. I looked down at the wrench, then back at her, trying to understand how tightening a hinge turned into a neighborhood emergency. The officers exchanged a look. Subtle, quick, but it was there. That moment when reality doesn't quite match the report. Leather creaked as one of them shifted, eyes moving between us, waiting for something to make sense. It didn't. We just need to ask a few questions. Calmer now. Procedural, like he was already adjusting the situation in his head. I nodded. Slow. Set the wrench down. Clink. Louder than it should have been, because everything felt louder when it wasn't supposed to be happening. My pulse stayed steady. Not calm, controlled. The kind you learn when situations start leaning in directions you didn't choose. Across the street, Linda's smile stretched just a little wider. She thought this was it. The moment I'd get corrected, adjusted, put back in line. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that she had already made the one move she couldn't take back. Because when you call the police, you don't control what they see. You don't control what they ask. And you definitely don't control what gets documented. That's when the door behind me opened. Slow, deliberate, wood shifting against frame, just loud enough to pull every eye in the driveway. The officers turned first, then Linda, then me. I didn't move, didn't speak. I didn't need to, because I already knew who was stepping out onto that porch. And more importantly, I knew exactly what they were carrying. A folder, thin, unremarkable, the kind of thing nobody pays attention to until it changes everything. Linda's smile flickered, just for a second, barely noticeable, but it was there. Because whatever she thought this morning was going to be, it wasn't this. Not anymore. The officer closest to me glanced back at her, then at the porch, then back at me. And for the first time since they arrived, his tone shifted. Less command, more curiosity. Sir, is there something we should know? I finally looked up, met his eyes, then glanced toward the porch again. Timing matters. And this was the moment everything turned. Yeah, I said. Calm. Even. Measured. There is. The footsteps behind me reached the edge of the porch. Stopped. And just like that, what Linda thought was a complaint became a record. What she thought was pressure became evidence. And what she thought would put me in my place was about to do the exact opposite. So before we go any further, I want you to think about something. If someone tried to use rules against you, would you argue? Or would you wait until those same rules started working in your favor? Because what happened next is exactly why you don't call authorities unless you're absolutely sure you're on the right side of the law. The door eased open with that familiar slow hinge I had been meaning to oil for weeks, and Rachel stepped out onto the porch like she had all the time in the world, like 3 patrol cars in our driveway was just another Tuesday morning detail she had already accounted for before her first cup of coffee. She wore a plain gray sweatshirt, sleeves pushed up just enough to reveal the faint tan line where her watch usually sat. hair pulled back in that no-nonsense way that somehow made everything feel more controlled, more deliberate. To anyone else, she probably looked like she had just stepped out to check the mail. To me, there was something different in the way her eyes moved, calm but sharp, taking in everything in a single sweep. The officers, the vehicles, Linda standing across the street like she owned the scene. I had seen that look before, just not here, not on this driveway, not with our neighbors watching from behind half-open blinds. "Morning," she said, voice steady, not raised, not rushed, just enough to cut through the tension without adding to it. One of the officers straightened slightly, almost instinctively, like something about her presence shifted the balance in a way he could not quite explain yet. Rachel stepped down onto the concrete, the soft thud of her sneakers barely audible over the low hum of idling engines and radio chatter leaking from a shoulder mic. She did not look at me first. She looked at them. That was always her way. Assess the situation, understand the players, then decide where to stand. I remembered the first time I realized there was more to her job than she let on. It was 2 years ago, back when we were still unpacking boxes in this same garage, cardboard dust floating in the afternoon light, the smell of fresh paint clinging to everything. She had come home late, uniform folded over her arm, not wearing it, never wearing it outside of where she had to, like she preferred the job to stay where it belonged. I had asked her once why she kept things so quiet, why the neighbors only knew her as someone who worked in county administration. She had smiled, not dismissive, just measured, and said, "It is easier when people underestimate you." At the time, I thought it was just about privacy. Standing there now, watching the way those officers subtly shifted their posture without knowing why, I started to understand it was something else entirely. "We received a call about a disturbance," the first officer said. His tone softer than before, less certain, like the script he had started with no longer quite fit the situation in front of him. Rachel nodded once, slow, acknowledging without agreeing, her gaze drifting briefly toward the garage, then back to him. "What kind of disturbance?" she asked, and there was something in the way she said it that made the question feel less like curiosity and more like calibration. Behind them, Linda let out a small, impatient sigh, loud enough to be heard, subtle enough to pretend it was not intentional. "They have been running tools all morning," she said, stepping forward again, reclaiming the spotlight she thought she had secured. Loud, disruptive, completely against community standards. Rachel finally turned her head toward her, just a slight movement, but it was enough to make Linda pause for half a second, like she had just stepped into a conversation she did not fully control anymore. The breeze picked up, carrying the scent of someone's lawn clippings down the block, mixing with the faint metallic tang from the tools on my workbench. It felt like the whole street was holding its breath, waiting to see which way this would go. Rachel took another step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to close the distance between her and the officers, placing herself squarely in the center of whatever this situation had become. "And you decided this required 3 units?" she asked, still calm, still even, but now there was an edge beneath it, something you could miss if you were not paying attention. The officer hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was there, that crack in the confidence that had brought them here in the first place. I watched Linda's expression shift again, that smile tightening, like she could feel something slipping but could not yet see what it was. And that was when I realized this was not going to end the way she thought it would. The hesitation hung in the air longer than it should have, subtle but impossible to ignore once you noticed it, like a missed step in a rhythm that had been perfectly controlled just seconds before, and Rachel saw it too because her eyes narrowed just slightly, not in suspicion but in recognition, like she had just confirmed something she already suspected. Linda, on the other hand, leaned forward into that silence, trying to fill it before it could turn into doubt, her heels clicking again as she moved closer, that clipboard tucked under her arm like it gave her authority that could not be questioned. "This has been ongoing," she said, voice tightening just enough to lose that polished sweetness. "I have documented everything, noise violations, unauthorized work, disruption to the community." She gestured toward my garage like it was evidence instead of a place where I spent a few hours fixing things most weekends. The officer closest to her gave a small nod, but it was not the same confident agreement from before, more like he was acknowledging her words without fully committing to them. Rachel shifted her weight, crossing her arms loosely, not defensive, just settled, like she was planting herself exactly where she needed to be. "Do you have a copy of those reports?" she asked, and there it was again, that calm tone that somehow made simple questions feel heavier than they should. Linda blinked, just once, caught off guard by the request, then quickly recovered, flipping open her clipboard with a sharp snap that echoed down the driveway. Papers rustled, a stack of printed complaints, timestamps, photos taken from angles that made everything look worse than it was. "I take my responsibilities seriously," Linda said, holding the papers out like they were proof of something undeniable. Rachel did not reach for them right away. Instead, she looked past Linda, down the street, where more neighbors had started gathering in small clusters, pretending to check their mail or walk their dogs while their attention stayed locked on us. The low murmur of their voices blended with the distant whir of a lawn mower somewhere 2 houses over, creating this strange, almost normal backdrop to something that felt anything but. I could feel the weight of all those eyes, the quiet judgment, the curiosity, the expectation that this would turn into something worth talking about later. Rachel finally took the papers, flipping through them slowly, her fingers moving with deliberate care, like she was not just reading but measuring, comparing, building a picture piece by piece. "These timestamps," she said after a moment, tapping one page lightly, "they are all within the same hour." Linda's chin lifted slightly, defensive now, like she had been challenged in a way she did not expect. "Yes, that is when the disturbances occur," she replied quickly. Rachel nodded again, but this time there was a faint hint of something else in her expression, something sharper, more focused. "And you called emergency services based on this?" she asked, her eyes lifting from the paper to meet Linda's directly. The officer shifted again, the radio on his shoulder crackling softly with a dispatch call that he did not respond to right away, like he was suddenly more interested in how this conversation was unfolding. Linda's smile faltered for just a second, barely noticeable, but enough. "I called because the situation was escalating," she said, but the confidence from earlier was thinner now, stretched just enough to show where it might break. Rachel handed the papers back without comment, letting them rest against Linda's outstretched hand instead of placing them firmly, a small detail that somehow made the exchange feel less equal than it had started. "I see," Rachel said, and the words were simple, but they carried weight now, like they meant more than they sounded. The breeze shifted again, carrying the faint scent of someone grilling down the block, mixing with the exhaust from the patrol cars, and for a moment everything felt strangely still, like the entire street was waiting for the next move. Linda adjusted her stance, shoulders tightening, eyes flicking briefly toward the officers as if checking whether they were still on her side. They did not move. They did not speak. And that silence said more than anything else could have. Rachel took a small step closer, closing the gap just enough to make it clear she was not stepping back from this. And for the first time since this started, Linda looked uncertain about what she had set in motion. I could see it now, that tiny crack forming beneath all that confidence, the realization that this situation was not following the script she had written in her head. And something about the way Rachel was standing there told me she was about to find out exactly how far off she had been. The shift was almost invisible, but once it started, it did not stop, like a slow crack spreading through glass that had been under pressure for too long, and Rachel did not rush it, did not force anything. She just let the moment stretch until the weight of it settled exactly where it needed to. One of the officers cleared his throat quietly, adjusting his stance again, his eyes flicking toward his partner before returning to Rachel, like he was waiting for direction without realizing he was doing it. Linda caught that too, and her posture changed, shoulders pulling back, chin lifting higher, like she could reclaim control just by standing taller. "This is getting unnecessary," she said, voice sharper now, the sweetness gone completely, replaced with something more brittle. "I made a legitimate report. I expect it to be handled accordingly." The word accordingly hung there, heavy with implication, like she was reminding everyone what side they were supposed to be on. Rachel did not react right away. She let the silence sit again, just long enough to make Linda fill it with her own tension. Then she tilted her head slightly, studying her in a way that felt less like conversation and more like evaluation. "You said this has been ongoing," Rachel replied, calm as ever. "How many times have you called this in?" Linda hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. That is not relevant, she said quickly, brushing it off with a small wave of her hand. Rachel's eyes did not leave hers. It becomes relevant when emergency services are involved, she said, her tone still even, but now carrying a quiet firmness that had not been there before. The officer nearest to them shifted again, his radio giving off a short burst of static, and this time he reached up to adjust it, more out of habit than necessity, like he needed something to do with his hands while the conversation moved in a direction he had not expected. I could feel the temperature of the moment changing, not physically, but in that subtle way where everything sharpens, every sound becomes clearer, every movement more noticeable. The hum of the engines, the rustle of leaves, even the faint click of Linda's nails against her clipboard as she tightened her grip. I am trying to maintain standards, Linda insisted, her voice rising just enough to carry to the neighbors who were now openly watching, no longer pretending they were not involved. That is my responsibility. Rachel nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it, and then took a slow breath, like she was deciding exactly how far to let this go. Standards are one thing, she said, calling in multiple units for a non-emergency is another. The officer on the far side of the driveway shifted his weight, his boots scraping lightly against the gravel, and for the first time since they arrived, he looked directly at Linda instead of me. That look was not accusatory, not yet, but it was no longer neutral either. Linda noticed it immediately. Her confidence flickered again, just a brief interruption in the performance she had been maintaining since the sirens first echoed down the street. I felt threatened, she said, the words coming out quicker now, less polished, like she was reaching for something that would justify everything all at once. Rachel's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did, something sharper, more focused. Threatened by what exactly? She asked. Linda opened her mouth, then paused, her gaze darting briefly toward my garage, the tools, the open door, the completely ordinary scene that had somehow been turned into this. The noise, the disruption, she trailed off, and for a moment there was nothing there to finish the sentence. The officer closest to her exhaled slowly, not loud, but enough to be heard in the quiet. It was the kind of sound that carried realization with it, the kind that said something was not lining up the way it should. Rachel took one more step forward, closing the distance just enough that there was no confusion about who was leading this now. "Ma'am," she said, her voice still calm but now unmistakably firm. "Misusing emergency services is a serious matter." The words landed differently than anything she had said so far, not louder, not harsher, but heavier, like they carried consequences that had not been part of Linda's plan. The neighbors went quiet. Even the distant lawn mower seemed to fade, like the entire street was leaning in to catch what would come next. Linda's grip on her clipboard tightened again, her knuckles widening just slightly, and for the first time since this started, she did not have an immediate response ready. I watched her search for it, watched the certainty she had walked in with start to unravel piece by piece, and something told me she was only just beginning to understand the position she had put herself in. The word serious did not echo, but it lingered, settling into the space between them like something that could not be ignored once it was said, and Linda felt it because her posture stiffened, her shoulders tightening as if bracing against something she could not yet see. "I did what anyone would do," she replied, her voice sharper now, a little louder, like volume alone might bring the moment back under her control. There were violations, repeated ones, and no one else was addressing them. She gestured again toward my garage, toward the open door, the neatly stacked tools, the ladder leaning against the wall, all of it suddenly framed like evidence in a case that did not exist. Rachel followed the gesture briefly, her eyes scanning the same space, but instead of finding fault, she seemed to be confirming the opposite, like each detail only reinforced what she already knew. And before calling this in, Rachel said slowly, turning her attention back to Linda, "Did you attempt any direct resolution?" Linda hesitated again, the pause longer this time, more noticeable, and the neighbors watching from the sidewalks shifted slightly, the quiet murmur rising just enough to carry curiosity through the air. "That is not required," Linda answered, but the confidence in her voice was thinner now, stretched over something uncertain. Rachel nodded once, acknowledging the answer without accepting it, her arms still loosely crossed, her stance unchanged. "No," she said, "but it is usually the first step." One of the officers shifted again, his boots scraping softly against the gravel, and this time he glanced toward his partner with a look that was no longer neutral, no longer procedural, but questioning. The dynamic had changed, and everyone could feel it, even if they could not explain why. Linda's eyes flicked toward them, catching that shift, and for the first time since this began, there was something close to urgency in the way she spoke. "Are you just going to stand there?" she said, her voice tightening, the polished tone slipping further. "This is exactly the kind of behavior we are trying to prevent in this community." The officer nearest her straightened slightly, but he did not step forward, did not move toward me, did not reach for anything. Instead, he looked back at Rachel, like he was waiting for something he could not quite name. That was when I realized the moment had already tilted, not dramatically, not in a way that made headlines, but in that subtle, undeniable way where authority starts to shift from one person to another without anyone announcing it. Rachel uncrossed her arms then, letting them fall naturally at her sides, a small movement that somehow carried more weight than anything else she had done so far. "Ma'am," she said, her voice still calm, but now edged with something firmer, something that did not invite interruption. "Emergency resources are limited. When they are used, it needs to be for situations that require them." Linda let out a short, incredulous breath, shaking her head slightly, as if she could not believe what she was hearing. "So now I am the problem?" she asked, her voice rising just enough to carry across the street, pulling the attention of every neighbor still watching. Rachel did not react to the volume, did not mirror it, did not escalate. She simply held her ground, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. "I am saying," Rachel replied, "that the situation you described does not match the response that was initiated." The words were precise, measured, leaving no room for interpretation. The officer on the far side of the driveway shifted again, this time taking a small step back, creating space where there had been tension just moments before. It was not a retreat, not exactly, but it was not an advance either. It was something in between, something that suggested reevaluation. Linda saw it, and her grip on the clipboard tightened again, the papers inside crinkling softly under the pressure. "This is unacceptable," she said, but the certainty was gone now, replaced with something closer to frustration. "I will be reporting this." Rachel tilted her head slightly, considering the statement, and for a brief moment, there was something almost unreadable in her expression, like she was deciding how much to say and how much to hold back. "You are welcome to do that," she replied, her tone unchanged, "but I would recommend being very clear about the details." The breeze picked up again, carrying the distant sound of a car, doors slamming somewhere down the block, grounding the moment in something ordinary even as everything else felt anything but. Linda opened her mouth to respond, then stopped, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied Rachel more closely, like she was trying to place something she had missed. And that was when I saw it, that flicker of realization just starting to form, the sense that she was no longer entirely sure who she was dealing with. The realization did not arrive all at once for Linda. It crept in slowly, like a shadow stretching across something she thought was fully lit, and the more she looked at Rachel, the less certain she seemed about the ground she was standing on. "I know everyone in this neighborhood," she said, her voice tightening again, searching for footing, "and I do not recall you being on any of the committees." The comment landed with a faint ripple through the small crowd that had gathered, a few neighbors exchanging glances, like they were waiting to see how Rachel would respond to being placed in that narrow definition of belonging. Rachel did not react immediately. She let the words pass, let them sit, like they were not worth interrupting, and instead turned her attention briefly toward the officers again, her gaze steady, almost reassuring in a way that seemed to ease whatever uncertainty had started to build between them. Then she looked back at Linda, just as calm as before. "That is because I am not on any of your committees," she said simply. There was no defensiveness in it, no need to justify or explain, just a statement of fact that somehow carried more weight than Linda's attempt to define her. Linda's lips pressed together, her expression tightening as she adjusted her stance again, shifting her weight from one heel to the other. "Well, that explains it," she said, a hint of forced confidence returning, like she had found a thread to pull. You are not familiar with how things are done here. The words sounded practiced, like something she had said many times before, something that usually worked. But this time, they landed differently. Rachel's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in the way she stood, a slight straightening of her posture that made her seem taller without actually moving. I am very familiar with how things are supposed to be done, she replied, her voice still even, but now carrying a quiet authority that had not been fully visible until this moment. One of the officers glanced at her again, longer this time, his brow furrowing slightly, like a piece of a puzzle was starting to fall into place, but had not yet fully connected. Linda caught that look too, and it unsettled her more than anything Rachel had said so far. Then you should understand that I am acting within my rights, she insisted, her voice rising again, not quite losing control, but no longer fully composed. This community has standards, and I am responsible for enforcing them. Rachel nodded once, acknowledging the statement, but her eyes did not soften. Enforcing community standards does not extend to emergency dispatch, she said, and the way she said it made it sound less like an opinion and more like something already established, something not open for debate. The officer nearest to them shifted again, this time taking a small step to the side, his stance widening slightly, not in tension but in readiness, like he was preparing for something he could not yet see but could feel coming. The radio on his shoulder crackled again, a dispatcher's voice cutting through briefly before fading into static, and he did not respond, his attention fixed on Rachel now in a way that was no longer casual. Linda's eyes narrowed, studying Rachel more closely, her earlier certainty giving way to something more cautious. "And what exactly makes you so sure of that?" she asked, her tone sharper now, edged with something that sounded almost like suspicion. Rachel held her gaze for a moment, letting the question hang there, letting the silence stretch just enough to draw everyone's attention tighter around them. The breeze had died down, leaving the air still, heavy with the quiet tension of people waiting for something to shift. I could hear the faint ticking of the cooling engine from one of the patrol cars, the soft creak of someone shifting their weight on a porch across the street, even the distant bark of a dog 2 houses over, all of it sharpening the moment without breaking it. Rachel took a slow breath, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just enough to steady the space around her, and then she stepped forward again, closing the gap between herself and the officers by a fraction, placing herself squarely at the center of everything that had been set in motion. She did not raise her voice, did not change her tone, but there was something unmistakable in the way she spoke next, something that made every officer on that driveway straighten just a little more, even before she finished the sentence. "Because this is not a community standard issue," Rachel said, her voice calm but carrying a weight that seemed to settle over everything at once. "This is a misuse of county resources." The words did not land loudly, but they hit with a precision that made the officers straighten almost instinctively, like something in the phrasing triggered recognition before their minds fully caught up. One of them blinked, his gaze sharpening as he looked at her again, really looked this time, not as a homeowner or a bystander, but as something else he was trying to place. Linda froze for just a fraction of a second, the clipboard in her hands lowering slightly, as if her grip had loosened without her noticing. "That is your opinion," she replied quickly, trying to recover, but the confidence in her voice was thinner now, stretched tight over uncertainty. Rachel did not react to the pushback. She did not need to. She took another small step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to shift the center of gravity of the moment even further in her direction. "It is not," she said, her tone still even. "It is policy." The officer closest to her drew in a quiet breath, his shoulders lifting slightly before settling again, and then he glanced toward his partner, a silent exchange passing between them that did not need words. Linda noticed it immediately. Her eyes darted between them, searching for the control she had moments ago, the authority she thought she held when those patrol cars first rolled in. "I called because I felt unsafe," she insisted again, but now the words sounded rehearsed, like she was repeating something she had already said instead of building a case. Rachel tilted her head slightly, considering her, not dismissing, not agreeing, just measuring. "And you communicated that clearly to dispatch?" she asked. The question was simple, but it carried an edge that had not been there before, something that made it clear this was no longer just a conversation. Linda opened her mouth, then paused, her gaze flicking briefly toward the officers again, like she was looking for confirmation before answering. "I explained the situation," she said finally, but the certainty was gone, replaced with something that sounded more like justification than fact. Rachel nodded once, slowly, as if that answer had confirmed exactly what she needed. The breeze shifted again, carrying the faint scent of someone brewing coffee down the block, a normal detail that felt strangely out of place against the tension now tightening around us. One of the officers reached up and pressed a button on his radio, not speaking into it, just holding it for a second like he was considering something, then letting it go. "Ma'am," he said carefully, addressing Linda now, his tone noticeably different than before, more measured, more cautious. "What exactly did you report to dispatch?" Linda's head turned sharply toward him, surprise flashing across her face, quickly followed by irritation. "I told them there was a disturbance," she said, her voice tightening again, "that there was disruptive activity that needed to be addressed." The officer nodded slightly, but it was not agreement, not approval, just acknowledgement. "Did you indicate any immediate threat?" he asked. The question hung there, heavier than the last, and for a moment, Linda did not answer. The silence stretched, pulling the attention of every neighbor still watching, every small movement in the background fading into something distant and unimportant. Rachel did not move, did not speak. She simply watched, her expression steady, her presence anchoring the moment in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Linda shifted her weight again, the heel of her shoe clicking against the pavement in a sharp, isolated sound. "I told them it was escalating," she said finally, but the words lacked conviction, like even she could hear how thin they sounded now. The officer's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in understanding, and he glanced back at Rachel one more time, that same look from earlier returning, only now it was clearer, more certain. Linda saw it too, and this time, she could not hide the flicker of unease that crossed her face. The control she had walked in with was slipping, piece by piece, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Rachel took a slow breath, her shoulders settling, and for the first time since this began, there was a subtle shift in her expression, something just beneath the surface, like she had reached a point she had been moving toward all along. And that was when she finally decided to stop holding back. The shift in Rachel was subtle, but it carried a finality that even the officers seemed to recognize before. Anything was said, like a quiet line had just been crossed, and there was no going back from it. She let the silence settle for one more second, just enough to make sure everyone was paying attention, then reached into the front pocket of her sweatshirt with a slow, deliberate motion. It was not dramatic, not rushed, just controlled, like every movement was intentional. Linda's eyes followed the motion immediately, narrowing slightly, suspicion mixing with that growing unease she could no longer hide. The officers did the same, their posture tightening just a fraction, not in alarm, but in focus. Rachel pulled out a small leather wallet, worn just enough to show it was used often, but kept in perfect condition, and held it for a moment at her side before flipping it open with a soft, precise motion. The badge caught the light first, a brief flash of polished metal reflecting the morning sun, followed by the identification card beneath it. She did not thrust it forward, did not wave it around. She simply held it up at chest level, angled so the officers could see it clearly without her needing to step closer. "Rachel Cole," she said, her voice steady, unchanged, county sheriff. The words landed with a quiet weight that rippled outward, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. The officer nearest her straightened instantly, his posture snapping into something more formal without hesitation, his expression shifting from uncertainty to recognition in a single beat. "Sheriff," he said, the word coming out before he could stop himself, like it was reflex more than decision. His partner mirrored the movement a second later, shoulders squaring, stance adjusting, the subtle cues of respect falling into place as if they had always been there, just waiting to be triggered. Linda did not move at first. She stood there, the clipboard still in her hands, her expression frozen in that exact moment between disbelief and understanding, like her mind was trying to process what she was seeing and failing to keep up. "That is not," she started, But the words did not finish, trailing off into nothing as she looked from the badge to the officers and back again, searching for something that would make sense in her version of the situation. Rachel closed the wallet with the same calm precision she had opened it, slipping it back into her pocket like it was just another part of the morning routine. Dispatch logs all calls, she continued, her tone unchanged, but now carrying a clarity that cut through any remaining confusion. Timestamps, descriptions, caller statements. The officer on the far side nodded slightly, his jaw tightening in understanding, like he was already replaying the call in his head, matching it against what had just been revealed. Linda's grip on the clipboard loosened, the papers inside shifting slightly as her fingers adjusted, and for the first time since this began, she took a small step back without realizing it. "I was just trying to," she said, her voice quieter now, the sharp edges gone, replaced with something that sounded uncertain, unfinished. Rachel did not interrupt her. She let the words hang there, incomplete, like they were not enough to carry any weight anymore. The breeze picked up again, lifting a corner of one of Linda's papers, the soft rustle sounding louder than it should have in the silence that followed. Across the street, one of the neighbors lowered their phone slightly, the tension of the moment shifting into something else, something that looked a lot like realization spreading through the small crowd. The officer closest to Linda shifted his stance again, but this time it was not toward me, not toward the garage. It was toward her, just a slight turn of his shoulders that changed the direction of the entire scene. "Ma'am," he said carefully, his tone respectful but firm. "We need to clarify the details of your call." Linda looked at him, then at Rachel again, her earlier certainty gone completely now, replaced with something that bordered on disbelief. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out, just a brief, silent hesitation that said more than any explanation could. Rachel stood still, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, not pressing, not escalating, just present in a way that made it clear she did not need to do anything more for the situation to resolve itself. The sound of a distant car passing at the end of the street broke the stillness for a moment, grounding everything in something normal again. But the shift had already happened, and there was no undoing it. Linda glanced around, taking in the officers, the neighbors, the entire scene that had turned in a direction she had not anticipated, and for the first time, she looked like someone who understood exactly how far she had misjudged it. The word sheriff did not echo, but it settled into everything like gravity, shifting the weight of the moment in a way that could not be undone, and you could see it in the way the officers adjusted without being told, their posture aligning, their attention narrowing with a clarity that had not been there before. "Ma'am," the lead officer said again, this time more deliberate, more formal, his tone no longer carrying even a hint of uncertainty. "We need to understand exactly what was reported." He stepped slightly closer to Linda, not aggressively, not confrontational, but with a purpose that made it clear the direction of this conversation had changed. Linda swallowed, the motion small but visible, her eyes flicking between him and Rachel like she was trying to find an exit that was no longer there. "I already explained," she said, but the words came out softer now, less certain, like they had lost their footing somewhere along the way. The officer nodded once, not dismissing her, but not accepting the answer either. "We are going to go through it again," he replied, his voice calm but firm, the kind of tone that did not invite argument. Behind him, his partner shifted position, moving just enough to create space between Linda and the rest of the driveway, not isolating her, but redefining where everyone stood. The subtlety of it made it even more noticeable. Rachel remained where she was, just off to the side now, no longer the center of attention, but still the anchor of the entire scene, her presence steady, her expression unchanged. She did not need to step in again. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. Linda adjusted her grip on the clipboard, the papers inside rustling as her fingers tightened, then loosened again. "There was excessive noise," she began, her voice careful now, like she was choosing each word instead of letting them come naturally. "Ongoing disturbances that were affecting the neighborhood." The officer listened without interrupting, his gaze steady, his stance grounded. "Did you indicate that there was an immediate threat to safety?" he asked, repeating the question from before, but this time there was no room left for deflection. Linda hesitated, her eyes dropping briefly to the papers in her hands. Then, lifting again, searching for something that would make this answer easier. I said it was escalating, she replied. But even as she said it, it sounded less like a statement and more like something she hoped would be enough. The officer's expression did not change, but there was a subtle tightening around his eyes, a shift that suggested he had already reached a conclusion. "Ma'am, escalation and immediate threat are not the same," he said, his tone still respectful, but now carrying a clarity that left little room for interpretation. A faint murmur moved through the neighbors watching from the street. Not loud, not disruptive, just a ripple of understanding passing from one person to the next. The balance had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Linda's shoulders dropped slightly, the tension she had been holding finally starting to show in the way she stood, the way her voice no longer carried the same sharp certainty. "I was trying to prevent a situation," she said, quieter now, her words trailing just a little at the end. The officer nodded once, acknowledging the intent without validating the action. "We understand that," he said. "But the way this was reported matters." He glanced briefly toward Rachel, not for instruction, but with a recognition that was now fully formed, then returned his focus to Linda. "Dispatch records everything," he continued, "including how situations are described and prioritized." Linda's gaze followed his for a split second, landing on Rachel again, and this time there was no confusion in her expression, only the realization of what she had overlooked from the very beginning. Rachel did not react to the look. She simply stood there, calm, composed, like she had known this moment was coming all along. The breeze picked up again, carrying the distant sound of a car engine turning over somewhere down the block, grounding the scene in something ordinary even as everything else felt anything but. One of the neighbors shifted their weight on the sidewalk, the faint crunch of gravel underfoot echoing softly, and for a moment, the entire street seemed to hold still, waiting to see how this would resolve. Linda opened her mouth as if to speak again, then stopped, her expression tightening as she seemed to realize that anything she said now would only add to what had already been set in motion. The officer took a small step back, giving her space, but not stepping away from the situation, his posture still firm, still attentive. Rachel glanced toward me briefly, just a quick look, not to check in, not to reassure, but something else, something quieter, like she was confirming that everything was unfolding exactly as it should. And in that moment, it became clear this was not where it ended. The air did not relax after that realization. It tightened, like something invisible had just been drawn into focus and no one could look away from it anymore. And even the small, ordinary sounds of the neighborhood seemed sharper now. The hum of an air conditioner down the block, the faint chirp of birds overhead, all of it framing the moment in a way that made it feel more deliberate. The lead officer shifted his stance again, squaring his shoulders as he looked directly at Linda, no longer glancing between her and Rachel, no longer balancing two sides of a situation that had already begun to resolve itself. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady, measured, "we are going to need to verify the details of your call with dispatch." The words were calm, but they carried a direction that was no longer optional. Linda's fingers tightened around her clipboard again, the edges of the paper bending slightly under the pressure. "I already told you what happened," she replied, but the resistance in her voice sounded weaker now, like it was losing ground with every sentence. The officer nodded once, not dismissing her, but not accepting the statement as final either. "We understand that," he said, "but we need to confirm how the situation was communicated." Behind him, his partner reached up to his radio again, pressing the button this time, his voice low as he requested a playback of the original call details. The crackle of the radio response came back almost immediately, a faint voice confirming the request, the words not fully clear but unmistakably procedural. Linda's eyes flicked toward the radio, then back to the officer, her expression tightening as the reality of what was happening began to settle in. She was no longer directing the situation. She was being reviewed by it. Rachel remained still, her posture relaxed, her hands at her sides, not intervening, not guiding, simply allowing the process to unfold. She did not need to say anything else. The system, she understood better than anyone else, was already doing the work for her. A light breeze moved through the driveway again, lifting a few strands of Rachel's hair and carrying with it the faint scent of coffee from somewhere nearby. a reminder of how normal the morning had been just minutes before everything shifted. One of the neighbors took a step closer along the sidewalk, the crunch of gravel under their shoe echoing softly, and a few others leaned slightly forward, their attention no longer hidden. Linda noticed them, her gaze sweeping across the small audience, and for the first time, there was something like self-awareness in her expression, a recognition that this was no longer a private enforcement of rules, but something far more public. The radio crackled again, louder this time, the dispatcher's voice more distinct as it relayed the summary of the call. The officer listened carefully, his expression remaining neutral, but the slight tightening of his jaw suggested he was hearing exactly what he needed. He did not interrupt, did not react outwardly, just absorbed the information with a focus that made the moment feel even heavier. Linda shifted her weight again, her heel clicking against the pavement, a sharp, isolated sound that seemed louder than it should have been. "This is unnecessary," she said, her voice quieter now, less certain, like she was trying to pull the situation back before it moved any further away from her control. The officer did not look at her right away. He waited until the dispatcher finished, until the radio went quiet again, and only then did he lower his hand and turn his attention back to her. "Ma'am," he said, his tone unchanged but now carrying a clarity that had not been there before. The call was logged as a potential disturbance with implied safety concerns. Linda's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The officer continued, not raising his voice, not accusing, just stating what was now part of the record. "Based on what we are observing here, there is no immediate threat to safety." The words settled into the space between them, and this time, there was no way to push back against them, no angle to reinterpret what had already been confirmed. Linda's grip on the clipboard loosened, the papers inside shifting again, and she looked down at them briefly, as if they might offer something she could use, something she could say, but they were just paper now, no longer carrying the authority she had assigned to them. Rachel watched quietly, her expression composed, her presence steady, not pressing the moment forward but not stepping away from it either. The officer took a small step back, giving Linda space again, but the dynamic had already been set, and everyone could feel it. The neighbors remained still, their attention fixed, the quiet murmur from earlier gone completely, replaced with a silence that felt more like understanding than curiosity. Linda looked up again, her eyes moving from the officer to Rachel, and this time, there was no confusion, no attempt to reframe what was happening, just the clear recognition of how far things had shifted beyond her control. And the way Rachel met her gaze made it clear this was only the beginning of that realization. The silence that followed the officer's words was not empty. It was heavy, like the kind of quiet that comes after something has already been decided but not yet spoken out loud. And Linda felt it, because her posture changed again, her shoulders no longer squared, her stance no longer anchored, like the ground beneath her had shifted without warning. She looked down at the papers in her hand one more time, flipping one page over as if it might offer something she had missed, something she could still use to regain control, but the motion felt slower now, uncertain, like she already knew there was nothing left there. "I was trying to protect the neighborhood," she said finally, her voice quieter, the edge gone completely, replaced with something that sounded almost like justification. The officer listened, his expression steady, but there was no change in his posture, no softening in the way he stood. "We understand your intent," he replied, "but intent does not change how the call was made." The distinction hung there, clear and unmovable, and for the first time since this began, Linda did not push back immediately. She just stood there, absorbing it, her eyes drifting briefly toward the neighbors, then back to the officers, then finally landing on Rachel again. Rachel had not moved. She had not stepped forward, had not raised her voice, had not taken over the situation in any visible way. She simply stood there, calm and composed, letting everything unfold. Exactly as it should. That was what made it different. This was not force. This was process. The officer closest to Linda shifted slightly, reaching for a small notepad at his belt, flipping it open with a practiced motion that felt almost routine, except there was nothing routine about the way this moment had developed. "For documentation purposes," he said, his tone professional, "I am going to note that the reported conditions did not match what was observed on arrival." Linda's head lifted slightly at that, her eyes narrowing just a fraction, like she was trying to understand what that meant beyond the words themselves. "Is that necessary?" she asked, the question coming out softer than anything she had said so far. The officer did not hesitate. "Yes, ma'am," he answered simply, writing as he spoke, the scratch of pen against paper carrying a weight that echoed louder than it should have. Each word he wrote felt like it was anchoring the situation in something official, something that could not be undone or reinterpreted later. Behind him, his partner stood quietly, his attention still on Rachel, but now there was something else in his expression, something closer to respect than curiosity. The dynamic had fully shifted, and there was no mistaking it anymore. Linda shifted her weight again, her heel clicking softly against the pavement, but this time the sound did not carry the same sharp confidence it had earlier. It sounded smaller now, contained. "I did not realize it would be taken that seriously," she said, her voice dropping slightly, like she was speaking more to herself than to anyone else. The officer paused his writing for just a moment, glancing up at her, not unkindly, but with a clarity that did not soften the situation. "Emergency calls are always taken seriously," he said, then returned his attention to the notepad, finishing the line with a final, deliberate stroke. The breeze moved through the driveway again, lifting the edge of one of Linda's papers, and she reached out instinctively to hold it down, her fingers pressing against it like she needed something tangible to steady herself. Across the street, one of the neighbors shifted, the faint sound of a screen door creaking open somewhere down the block adding to the quiet backdrop of the moment. Rachel finally moved then, just a small step to the side, repositioning herself slightly. Not to take control, but to stand where she could see everything clearly. Her presence did not dominate the scene, but it anchored it in a way that made everything else feel more defined. Linda looked at her again, longer this time, her expression no longer defensive, no longer assertive, just searching, like she was trying to reconcile the version of events she had expected with the reality in front of her. "I was just doing my job," she said, the words softer now, almost uncertain. Rachel held her gaze for a moment, her expression unreadable, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of something more complex than either of them had said out loud. The officer closed his notepad, tucking it back into place, and straightened again, his posture returning to that same steady, professional stance he had adopted earlier, but now it carried a different meaning. This was no longer about responding to a call. It was about documenting what had actually happened. Linda glanced around once more, taking in the officers, the neighbors, the entire scene that had shifted so completely from where it began, and for a moment, it looked like she might say something else, something to try and reclaim even a small part of what she had lost. But she did not. She just stood there, the clipboard held loosely in her hands, as the weight of the situation settled fully into place. And the way the officers were standing now made it clear that what came next would not be up to her. The moment did not end with a dramatic shift or raised voices. It settled into something quieter, something heavier, like the kind of conclusion that does not need to be announced because everyone already understands it. And you could see that understanding move through the street, through the officers, through the neighbors still watching from a distance. The lead officer adjusted his stance once more, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to his partner, the kind of signal that did not require explanation. "We are going to clear this call," he said, his tone professional, steady, no longer carrying any uncertainty. "There is no active disturbance that requires further response." The words were simple, but they marked the end of something that had started very differently just minutes before. Linda's shoulders dropped slightly. At that, the last bit of tension she had been holding finally giving way, and she let out a breath she had probably been holding longer than she realized. "So that is it?" she asked, her voice quieter now, stripped of the sharp edges that had defined it earlier. The officer nodded once. "For this call, yes," he replied, then paused briefly before continuing. "But the details will be documented and reviewed as part of standard procedure." That part landed differently, more firmly, like it carried implications that extended beyond the driveway, beyond the moment itself. Linda's grip on the clipboard shifted again, her fingers adjusting around it, as if she was trying to hold on to something familiar, something that still made sense. "Reviewed?" she repeated, the words sounding unfamiliar in her own voice. The officer met her gaze directly, not unkindly, but without softening the message. Calls that involve emergency response are subject to review, he said, especially when the reported conditions do not align with what is observed. The explanation was clear, direct, leaving little room for interpretation. Rachel remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, not pressing the situation forward, not stepping away from it either, simply allowing it to resolve on its own terms. That was what made it final. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to escalate. The process had taken over completely. One of the officers turned slightly, glancing toward the patrol cars, then back to the driveway, as if confirming everything was in order before stepping away. The low hum of the engines seemed louder now, more noticeable, like the scene was beginning to return to something normal again. Across the street, one of the neighbors shifted, lowering their phone, the tension in their posture easing just a little, and a quiet murmur began to return, softer this time, more reflective than curious. Linda looked around, taking in the officers, the neighbors, the entire situation that had unfolded in a way she had not anticipated, and for a moment, she seemed smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way she carried herself, like the certainty that had defined her earlier had been replaced with something else entirely. "I was just trying to maintain standards," she said again, but this time it sounded more like a statement to herself than a defense to anyone else. Rachel's gaze softened just slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and she gave a small nod, the kind that recognized the intention without validating the outcome. The officer closest to Linda shifted his weight again, then gave a brief, polite nod. "We understand," he said, "but there are proper channels for addressing those concerns." The words were not harsh, not accusatory, but they carried a finality that made it clear the conversation had reached its end. He stepped back then, creating space, signaling without words that there was nothing more to be done here. The other officers followed suit, their movements coordinated but unhurried, like they were returning to routine after something that had briefly taken them out of it. The radios crackled softly again, dispatch voices filtering through, pulling their attention back to whatever came next beyond this street. Linda remained where she was, the clipboard still in her hands, but now it hung loosely at her side, no longer held with the same tight control as before. She glanced at Rachel one more time, her expression difficult to read, something between confusion and realization, like she was still trying to reconcile how the situation had shifted so completely. Rachel met her gaze for a moment, calm, composed, then simply turned slightly, her attention moving back toward the house, toward the normal rhythm of the morning that had been interrupted. The officers began to move toward their vehicles, the crunch of gravel under their boots sounding softer now, less urgent, and the red and blue lights that had painted the driveway earlier felt less intense, less commanding. The street was already beginning to return to its usual pace, the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood filling back and around the edges of what had just happened. Linda stood there for another second, then adjusted her grip on the clipboard, straightening the papers inside as if trying to restore some sense of order, before taking a small step back toward the sidewalk. And for the first time since the sirens had arrived, it felt like the moment was truly over, even though something about it still had not fully settled. The patrol cars rolled out one by one, tires crunching over gravel with a slower rhythm than when they arrived, the urgency gone, replaced with something measured, almost routine, and as the last set of red and blue lights faded at the end of the street, the color drained from the driveway, leaving everything looking exactly the way it had before, only it did not feel the same anymore. The air shifted back into something ordinary, but there was a residue to it, a quiet awareness that lingered in the way neighbors stood a little longer than usual, in the way conversations started and stopped as people processed what they had just witnessed. Across the street, someone finally closed their front door, the soft click echoing just enough to mark the transition back to normal, but even that normal felt slightly altered. Linda remained near the edge of the sidewalk, her posture no longer rigid, her clipboard now held loosely at her side instead of clutched like a symbol of control. She glanced once more toward Rachel, then toward me, then down at the paper she had been so certain would carry weight, and for a moment it looked like she might say something to reclaim a piece of what she had lost out here in the open. But the words never came. She turned instead, Her steps slower now, more deliberate, the sharp click of her heels softer against the pavement as she walked back toward her house. The door closed behind her with a muted thud, and just like that, the center of the storm disappeared. Rachel stood still for another second, her gaze following the last of the patrol cars as they disappeared down the block. Then she let out a small breath, not of relief, not of tension, just a quiet exhale that signaled the moment had passed. She turned slightly, stepping back toward the porch, her movements unhurried, like nothing about this needed to be rushed anymore. I stayed where I was for a moment, looking out over the street, noticing the small details that had been drowned out earlier, the faint hum of a lawn mower starting up again 2 houses over, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant sound of a car radio drifting through an open window. Everything had returned to normal, but it carried a different weight now, like the street itself had learned something it would not forget. Rachel paused at the bottom step, glancing back at me with that same calm expression she had held the entire time, and for a second, there was something almost amused in her eyes. Not at Linda, not at the situation, but at how predictable it had all been. "You left your coffee out," she said, her tone light, as if that was the only thing worth mentioning after everything that had just happened. I looked over at the porch railing where the mug still sat, untouched, a thin layer of steam no longer rising from it. "Figures," I said, stepping forward to grab it. The ceramic warm, but no longer hot. The taste was slightly bitter now, but familiar, grounding, like the rest of the morning was finally catching up to itself. Rachel stepped inside, the door opening with that same quiet creak, and I followed a moment later, glancing once more down the street before stepping over the threshold. From inside, the house felt exactly the same as it always had, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air, the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the small, ordinary sounds that made everything feel settled again. Rachel moved toward the counter, setting her keys down with a soft clink, then leaned lightly against it, her posture relaxed in a way that had not changed from the moment she stepped outside. "She is going to think twice next time," I said, taking another sip of the coffee, letting the bitterness settle. Rachel shook her head slightly, a faint smile touching the corner of her mouth. "It is not about thinking twice," she replied, her voice calm, measured, the same steady tone she had carried through the entire morning. "It is about understanding how things actually work." I nodded slowly, the weight of that settling in, not as a warning, not as a lesson, but as something simpler, something more grounded in reality than anything Linda had tried to enforce. Outside, the street continued on, unchanged on the surface, but quieter in a way that felt intentional, like everyone had seen enough for one morning. And as I set the empty mug down on the counter, I realized that sometimes the loudest kind of justice is the kind that never raises its voice.